Check, check, check. Check 1, check 2, checks good. Okay, let's go. It's 4:10 a.m. And according to Instagram, Jocko is not up yet. So let's rock and roll. This is episode 56 of the 40 Ounce Hemlock Podcast. This is part 6 of the current series. The current series is called Mind the Gap. I should say Mind, the Gap. Not to be confused with the well-known London Tube subway directive. Okay. Why is it called Mind the Gap? Well, I've been explaining that for 5 episodes now. I'll just say it real quick once more. Because it's about the gap between what we actually know about the mind versus what the experts tell us they know about the mind. And is about the irrevocable and uncrossable and unbridgeable gap between the reality of the human mind and the human brain. There is a gap. There's 2 gaps. There's a couple gaps. There's a gap in our knowledge, and there's a gap between what they present to us versus what is true about the difference between the mind and the brain. And yes, there's a difference between the mind and the brain. And this is so important, I've been saying for 5 episodes now, because they lie to you about this gap, thus creating the other gap. They lie to you about the gap, the existence of a gap between our knowledge of the mind and the brain. They lie to you about the existence. They lie to you about the identity of the mind and the brain. They tell you that they're the same thing, and they tell you that they've discovered this via science, right? And thus they're lying to you about their knowledge of the mind, because there is an irrevocable, uncrossable, unbridgeable gap between what the mind is and what it does and how it works and what all that means and the brain. But they don't want you to know this, so they've created this gap. And they hide behind this gap, and they use this gap, this is the further point, they use this gap to, and you might say, how does this happen? Listen, you got to listen to the previous 5 episodes of this series before you listen to this one. They use this gap in order to push onto you a view of a philosophical and more specifically a metaphysical view of what you are as a human person. They use this gap to push on you a view of those things that will make you more agreeable to, more amenable to, and more accepting of, ultimately, socialism. And thus, this whole game, this scam that I'm bringing out in this series, is part of the larger project of moving the culture in a socialist, communist, Marxist direction. And it's working. I don't know if you can tell lately, it's working. Okay? So this is part 6. Part 5, as stated last time, we began the deep dive. The deep dive comes in 2 parts. The first part of the deep dive last episode was to show you in no uncertain terms, if you're paying attention. I know there was some narrative in there. There's always a little bit of narrative in there because so much of this is about my own experience in academia. Part A of the deep dive was to show you that the whole big problem occurring in the history of ideas that they say was the motivation for moving away from the notion that the mind and the brain were different things. This whole problem that they teach you in Philosophy 101, in Philosophy of Mind 101, in Philosophy of Religion 101, this whole notion they teach you that we discovered in science and philosophy back in the days of the scientific revolution, a little bit before that with Rene Descartes, they tell you that there was this big problem that they discovered that proves that the mind has to be the brain. They found this problem with what Descartes was saying. And it was because of that problem that we were motivated to finally accept that the mind is in fact the brain. And then Darwin came along and solidified all that for us. Okay, last episode, part A of the deep dive, was to show you that that whole move was completely unmotivated. That the problem that they say was the intractable, insoluble, fatal problem with supposing that the mind and the brain are different things is not a problem at all. And I spelled that out I won't say clearly, but I spelled, sometimes it's 4 a.m, right? But I showed that. I hope I showed that in bold relief and very clearly in the second half of last episode. That was part A of the deep dive. So part A was to show you that it was never a problem in the first place, The problem with the traditional religious position that the mind and the brain are different things, flesh and spirit are different things, soul and body are different things, material and immaterial are different things. The whole problem that they tried to foist on you in your formal Western college education, the whole problem that they tried to saddle you with and saddle that view with is not a problem at all. And if you listen to the last episode, then you understand that now. Man, I got to get clicking here. I've slept I think I got the COVID, by the way, for the first time, in 3.5 years. I never had it. I think I might have had it. But I went crazy on the vitamin D and the zinc, and I slept all day yesterday, and which might explain why I'm doing a podcast at 4 a.m. right now. So part B of the deep dive is episode 56, and that's where we are now. What is part B of the deep dive? Well, it's, in a sense, the positive project to the negative project of part A of the deep dive. Part A, again, was to show you that it was never a problem in the first place, supposing that the mind and the brain are different, as all people, mostly in the history of thought, right, have traditionally thought. Supposing that they're different was never a problem in the first place. What's the name of the problem? The mind-body problem, as they teach it to you in philosophy, is not a problem at all. So now in part B of the deep dive, we're going to show you not only is that the case, but it's also the case, right? Here comes the second punch. Here comes the knockout blow. That it is impossible that the mind could be the brain. Okay? And that's really important because after Darwin comes along, supposedly saving them from the mind-body problem and showing that the human person is really just an accumulated, aggregated conglomeration of accidental physical interactions that have resulted in eventually a brain coming about that rose above the other species' brains and now studies itself and the other species and the world around it. All that's nonsense, okay? All that's nonsense. But after Darwin, there came a period in philosophy that I like to call the 100-year fail, okay? Where thinker after thinker, philosopher after philosopher of mind, theorist after theorist, put forward all these different theories trying to explain, trying to give an account, as they say in philosophy, of how the mind could be the brain. And each one of these theories failed. Okay? They all fail. I call it the 100-year fail. And at the end of this episode, by the end of this episode, you will be able to see why that has to be the case. Why they have to fail. It is impossible that the mind could be the brain. Okay? So that's where we are. This is part 6 of Mind the Gap. And to get it started, as we do often in philosophy, and as I've done several times so far, I'm sure, I'm going to give you a little thought experiment. And this one's my own. Sometimes I give you one that's given by another famous philosopher. This one's kind of my own, borrowed a little bit from some features of another one that I read that seemed to me very important, that needed some tweaking, and that with said tweaking could easily be used to show you what I'm about to show you, that, good Lord, if you can understand this, if you can see this by the time, I hope that I can do this for you, because this is so, as I've said in past episodes, freeing. And once you see it, it's just like, are you kidding me? And you'll never watch the evening news or the Sam Harris podcast, or you'll never watch anyone talking about the mind and the brain. You'll never watch it the same. You'll never hear, you'll see right through what they're doing, okay? And then in the next episode, we are in fact going to see right through what they're doing, because we're going to show some clips of people talking about this stuff where it's very evident that they do not understand what's going on here. All right. So found this little picture for my cover art here, and it's very appropriate because the thought experiment that I want to give you and put forward to you, I'm going to call it, what should I call it? The statue on the steps. Or no, I'm going to call it Charles Darwin falls down the stairs. Okay? All right. Let me take a sip of coffee and I'm going to do this. All right. Cue the coffee music. Okay. Okay. This is called Charles Darwin falls down the stairs. I want you to imagine that there is somewhere a museum. Pardon me. That's my throat. That's my tummy. I'm on an empty stomach here. I want you to imagine that there is somewhere a museum dedicated to the memory of that phase of modern history where materialists had hoped that Darwin's theory could, as Richard Dawkins once said, make it possible for them, the materialists, the atheists, the naturalists, to be intellectually fulfilled. That sad, albeit now concluded, after episode 56, that albeit now concluded phase of history where Darwin's theory was thought to even be possibly remotely true. Let me just stop here for a second and say, I know I'm talking about Darwin now, and you might think you've heard all the arguments against Darwin. I want to remind you, I got nothing against all those guys that talk about fossils and DNA and stuff like that. I love those guys. They're doing important work. They're my betters. I've interacted with quite a few of them over my graduate school years, and they're super intelligent, and they're super helpful, and they're doing really important work. It's just not what I do. Okay? I don't want to talk to you about fossils and DNA. The case against Darwin, the thing that's going to make you see that all of that is trash, is not that. It's not fossils and DNA and strata and geology. It's not the Cambrian explosion. All that's interesting, but this is the dagger. Okay? This is the dagger. So, back to the thought experiment. I want you to imagine that we've imagined there's this museum dedicated to Charles Darwin, and according to our cover art here, there is a museum dedicated to, what does it say in the little caption here? Unveiling the statue of the late Charles Darwin in the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. Okay, good. So the thing I was imagining actually exists. Great. I want you to imagine that there is a long, oh look, there's a staircase in the picture too. I want you to imagine that there's a long concrete staircase descending from the entrance. I don't know if it's the entrance in the picture, but I want you to imagine that there's a long concrete staircase descending from the entrance of the museum, and atop the final landing of that staircase near the entrance is a statue of the very man, Charles Darwin. Okay? He's sitting there looking as melancholy as ever, sunken eyes. Maybe he slipped through his mouth maybe he breathed through his mouth when he slept. That's why I got sunken eyes. I learned that midlife. Hey, you might want to, just as a side note, this radically affected me my whole life, and I never really realized it till I started investigating it and trying to change it. My mouth falls open when I sleep, and I've learned the connection. Why am I doing this right now? I've learned the connection between that and a lot of health problems that I've struggled with my whole life, and it's really interesting, and you should look into it. I'm not going to go into it here. Anyways, that statue sitting atop the steps with Charles Darwin looking, what did I say? He's always melancholy and drab, right? As melancholy as ever. Sunken eyes, his hairline ravaged by an as yet unknown to him genetics. He didn't know about genetics when he wrote his stuff. And his pursed lips hidden behind that gratuitous beard of his, which I'm kind of jealous of. Now, unbeknownst to the groundskeeping crew of this museum, the statue's foundation has become unmoored to the concrete below. Maybe due to the many tourist children climbing around and about it and hanging on it like monkeys, which proves Darwin was right, Now, imagine that on one blustery day, I'm imagining that the statue's outside. Just go with me. Imagine that on one particularly blustery day, a heavy wind comes along and causes the statue to rock back and forth and then fall over. Now, fortunately, the museum was closed that day, perhaps for some celebration of winter solstice or some such heartless holiday that the materialists go in for these days. Anyway, no tourists were harmed during the making of this thought experiment. The statue rocks back and forth with increasing force, and at a certain point, its own momentum combines with a final. Man, it's early. Sorry. I'm looking at Instagram here. Jocko's still not up. It combines with a final fortuitous gust of wind, and over it tumbles, okay? The statue falls over. It rolls across the top landing of the staircase and then off and down the first step, after which point there is simply no stopping it. With the unsettling stochastic crack of concrete on concrete, it bounces, rolls, ricochets, turns, and tumbles down the long staircase, leaving bits and pieces of its corners, edges, and least reinforced contours along the way. And they tumble after it like many loose pieces that parade after a landslide or an avalanche. All right. Now, just the pieces, just the edges, right? The thing itself, the statue itself, remains largely intact, right? He looks like he's going to make it pretty much unscathed until thwap. A final fall down the last set of stairs, combined with the lever-like force of Darwin's long, banal beard, momentarily bearing the weight of the whole edifice, causes the bloke's head to snap clean off, and thereby attain a centripetal spin from the final cajoling and roll down the sidewalk and into the street, just as one of those large street sweepers is coming by. Now, incidentally, the driver of the street sweeper has one hand on the wheel and his mind on the Discovery Institute podcast that he's listening to in his earbuds, and so it's the street sweeper's momentarily rattled by the clunk of the front wheels smashing the statue's head to bite-sized pieces, whereupon they're promptly swept away by the two rotating brushes attached to the undercarriage, and they are subsequently carried away to the trash heap of history. It's a little bit colorful, isn't it? It's a thought experiment. You gotta make it interesting. Okay, now, there it is. There's the thought experiment. What does this have to do with the mind and the brain? I'm about to tell you as I stretch. Okay, listen. Now, listen. We can make we can make a very important, very basic, very obvious, once you see it, observation about this incident. And from that observation, we can understand, ready? Why every materialist theory of mind must, without a doubt, fail. Further, and this is why I said two a moment ago, further, we can use this illustration in all its simplicity, despite my many colorful details, to diffuse even the most convoluted, annoyingly nuanced, and sophisticated attempts by materialists to get around the problem that their own leading lights have finally caught on to. I say finally because if you listen to this podcast, you know that I'm frequently highlighting dissenters among them and honest academics and philosophers that while they are not believers, while they are not theists, while they are not non-materialists, they still reveal the problems that their own colleagues hide from you with the gap. Okay? So let's look closely. Here is something that is both obvious and of immense philosophical import. Are you ready? I'm going to say this really slow because now we're going to get a little bit conceptual. And it's necessary to do this so you can see what the problem is with supposing that the mind is the brain. Okay, this gets really conceptual, but you'll see it. Okay, you ready? I'm going to use terms here like reference and representation and of and about and intentionality. I'm going to be introducing kind of all these terms and using them interchangeably. You will understand it by the time we're done finishing this sort of like examination of the thought experiment. The fact that the statue was a statue of, that is about, Charles Darwin, has nothing to do in determining the path down which the statue descends as it falls. And when I say it has nothing to do with it, the way to say this in philosophical language is to say it played no causal role. And yes, I said causal. That word, when you see it, is spelled very similarly to the word casual. I'm saying causal, C-A-U-S-A-L. It played no causal role. The fact that the statue is of, or about, or represents, or points to, or refers to Charles Darwin has nothing to do. It plays no causal role in determining the path down which the statue falls down the stairs. The fact that the statue represented Darwin is irrelevant to the causal transactions that statue enters into as it falls. What causal transactions? Well, you know, with the stairs, with the wind, with the air pressure, with gravity, all those, okay? Has nothing to do with it. It would do, you see? Has nothing to do with it. If you don't see, bear with me. To see that this is true, all you have to do is a little second thought experiment, or a second part to the first thought experiment. Just imagine that there's another world that is identical in all respects to our world, except that Darwin, like the actual man, never existed there. You can do this, right? This is just imagining. This is what philosophers do often. It's called a thought experiment. They change little things in one world to see how things would be different. Okay, just imagine that there's another world that's identical to our own, except Charles Darwin, that particular guy, never existed in that world. And who knows? Maybe instead we had like a different chap that was named Charles Darwin or something like that. Okay, and maybe he discovered, or he thought he discovered evolution. But just imagine that nonetheless, in this world, the one that we're imagining, because it's the same as our world in every respect, imagine that there was nonetheless, sitting atop the same museum steps, a statue that was physically identical to the statue of Darwin in our world, in the actual world. Okay? Now, to do this, you have to just ignore for the moment the difficult, but you should see, irrelevant question of the statue's origination. You might be like, well, how could there be a statue that looked identical if the guy didn't exist? It doesn't matter, okay? Perhaps there was some sculptor in our imaginary world that was only meaning to carve a fictional, ideal, gloomy naturalist, and the shape that he happened to sculpt just happened to be exactly the same shape that Darwin has in the actual world, our world. This is perfectly, as they say in philosophy, this is perfectly metaphysically possible. It's not probable, right? But it's perfectly possible, and that's all you need, okay? So there's an identical statue, but Darwin never existed there. We have in that world what we say, Charles Darwin. Okay. Now, you got all that? Here's the payoff. It should be clear to you that if all the conditions are the same in the two worlds, or imaginary world 1 and imaginary world 2. I guess I really shouldn't call imaginary world 1 imaginary, because there is, in fact, in England, a museum where there is such a statue sitting atop some steps. Like I said, it's inside. Who cares? Okay, I'll just call them two imaginary worlds. If all the conditions are the same in the two worlds, that is, if the statue weighs the same, if it has the same dimensions, if it sits at the same angle and sits there on a day with the same weather conditions, same temperature, same air pressure, same wind speed and velocity, and so on and so forth. If all that's true, then the statue in our second imaginary world, imagined world, will tumble and fall in the exact same manner as the Darwin statue had in the first world. Again, the fact that the statue represents Darwin in one world and not in the other. Remember, it doesn't represent Darwin in the second world because Darwin doesn't exist in that world. It could not represent him, but it looks the same. It has the same physical properties, as they say in philosophy. It has all the same physical properties. It's physically identical, okay? So the fact that the statue represents Darwin in one world and not the other has nothing to do with how it behaves, that is, again, with the causal transactions into which it enters. Just to appreciate this, we can also just imagine there's like a high definition security camera mounted on the side of the museum, and this camera records the whole event and it allows us to review it in minute detail, in slow motion, frame by frame, right? Sure enough, the tumbling statues trace identical paths down the stairs. They have to. Do you see this? They have to, because all the physical conditions and properties of the object and the environment in which it sits are identical. As they say in philosophy, all the antecedent conditions are the same. Okay? You see this? I think you see this. Now, why is this the dagger? Well, listen. In a moment, instead of talking about statues, we're going to talk about brains. Brains and statues are a lot alike. This is not in the script. Brains and statues are a lot alike. You might think, no, they're totally different. No. They're a lot alike. In fact, they are sufficiently alike for this thought experiment to be the dagger that is the death knell, that is the death blow for any supposition that the mind could be the brain. How are they a lot alike? They're both physical objects made up of physical stuff. that have to behave as they behave because of the physical laws which exist in the universe. Whether those be laws of gravity, whether those be laws of chemistry, whether those be laws of electricity and electromagnetism, and right, they're just physical stuff. And physical stuff does what physical stuff does because of the properties physical stuff has and the laws which obtain that govern physical stuff and what it does, okay? You understand? Physical laws are what they are. So for our purposes, a brain and a statue are perfectly sufficiently alike for this thought experiment. A brain is just a physical object being enacted on by forces within and without itself, which forces behave according to or obey the laws which govern it. Electricity flows through the human brain because of the laws that govern electricity and the stuff that the human brain is made of, right? It's very basic once you see it. Things do what they do because that's what science is. It's learning the laws that govern stuff, okay? I mean the real sciences, like the hard sciences, all right? Of which brain chemistry and, I don't know, what's the study of statue? I guess the study of rock, right? Okay, anyways. They're both physical things. And these folks that perpetuate the gap want you to believe that this one physical thing, the brain, is somehow different from every other physical thing in the universe. And yet it can't be on their own view, as you'll see in a moment, okay? Because they have to believe that all the things that a mind does and can do and the way a mind behaves can be accounted for in the same way that other physical things' actions can be accounted for, i.e., the laws that govern physical things in the universe. Okay. All right, let me expand a little bit. So, presumably, we believe a couple things about we believe a couple things intuitively about our minds. We have to, otherwise thinking is nothing, okay? All right, listen. We believe that one, our mental states. Now, let me just stop here real quick. I'm going to use these terms. When I say mental, you might picture in your mind a brain, but you can't do that. Philosophers use the word mental and mentality and things like that to describe what thinking is like from the inside, not from the outside when they're like looking at an MRI scan of a brain or something and seeing it as a physical object. Mental is used to describe thinking from the inside, the subjective point of view, like what it's like to think of something, what it's like to have an idea and the idea itself. It's like, okay, think of your grandmother right now. Okay, you've got this like image of your grandmother in your mind, right? Or you're associating it with some like past experiences with your grandma, or sitting at the table at breakfast in your grandma's house in the summer, having a bowl of Rice Krispies, like all these different thoughts and memories and things that you associate with the idea of your grandmother. These are all thoughts that are occurring in your mind. I can't see them. You can. That's what philosophers mean by the mental, okay? So when we say the mental, we're referring to thinking from the inside. When we say the physical and we talk about the brain, we're talking about the physical object, the brain, and its various states that it enters into from the outside, like if we have it on like the examination table, the brain itself, okay? We believe now, listen, we believe that our mental states enter into causal transactions both with each other and with the world around them. Otherwise, there's no such thing as thinking, okay? Like right now, I'm thinking to myself, some coffee would taste good right now. I'm thinking of coffee. I'm thinking of the cup before me. And I go, okay, I'll pick up this. I take a drink. So there my thoughts interacted with each other. I had the thought, I would like some coffee. I had the thought, there's some coffee in front of me. And then I picked up the coffee and drank it. Okay. So my thoughts interacted with each other and then with the physical world around me, the cup on the table before me, right? We believe that our mental states enter into causal transactions with each other and with the world around them. And two, we also believe that they do so in virtue of what they're about. There's that word again, about, of what they're of what's represented in them. What is represented in my thought right now? Coffee and the way it tastes and how good it would taste right now. And then I reach for my cup and I drink some coffee, okay? We believe that our thoughts, our mental states, mental, right, from the inside, we believe that our mental states enter into causal transactions with each other and with the world around them. That's just what's happening when we think thoughts in sequence, and when we think thoughts in sequence that lead to actions between us and our external environment. And we believe that they enter into these causal transactions in virtue of what they're about, right? I don't reach for my cup of coffee because I think, oh, synapses 4,000 through 6,000 are firing in my brain. I reach for my coffee because I think I'm thirsty, or I have the feeling of thirst, or I would like to taste the taste of coffee right now, or it's 4 a.m. and I'm really tired, but I want to get through this podcast, so I'm going to drink this coffee, right? We believe that our mental states enter into causal transactions with each other and with the world around them, and that they do so in virtue of what they're about. But aboutness, as you'll see in a moment, is a feature of the inside. It's a feature of the subjective point of view. I'm getting ahead of myself, okay? What our thoughts are about, what they refer to, what they represent, their meaning, in other words, is not in the brain. It's not intrinsic to it's not intrinsic to the physical structure of the state of the brain at any given time. In the same way, I hope you're seeing now, that there's nothing about the statue of Darwin on the steps that is intrinsically tied to Darwin. Why? Because we can certainly imagine an identical statue existing in the world where Darwin, the man as we know him, did not exist. What the statue is of, I said I was going to go real slowly and I keep speeding up. What the statue is of, what the statue is about, what the statue refers to or represents, does not affect the way the statue behaves as it tumbles down the stairs the least bit. The statue would tumble the same way even if Darwin never existed. And we know that the statue could exist even if Darwin never existed. And what these two facts show you is that the fact that the statue represents Darwin, or is about Darwin, or is about Darwin, is of Darwin, or represents or refers to Darwin, or as philosophers say, has Darwin as its intentional object, is not a property of the physical statue itself. Are you beginning to see the connection? What thoughts are about, what thoughts are of, what thoughts have as their intentional object, what thoughts point to or refer to or represent from the inside for the thinker, is not a part of the physical brain. A brain is just a lump of whatever it's a lump of in your head, right? And it fizzes and pops according to certain... It's got electricity flowing through it, through synapses and neurons and things like that. But, I mean, look. Think of Darwin right now. Okay, you're thinking of Darwin. Okay, when you did that, certain neurons fired, okay? But to suppose that the mind is the brain is to suppose that if Darwin, the guy, never existed, those neurons could never fire in that way, which is absurd. Okay? Let me just back up here. What the statue is of, what the statue is about, what the statue refers to does not affect the way the statue behaves as it tumbles down the stairs. The statue would tumble the same way even if Darwin never existed. And if you can see that, then you can see why the mind could never be the brain. Brain states occur and succeed one another in sequence because of the laws that govern the physical stuff and the environment the brain finds itself in. Chemistry, physics, electricity, and so on and so forth. And that's all. That's all that could determine why any particular brain state happens at any particular time. The ofness or aboutness of thoughts. Now we're talking about thoughts and brains, not the statue anymore. Do you see the connection, right? A statue is a thing that refers to something outside itself, just like a thought. Okay? But the same statue physically could exist without that thing external to itself ever existing. And that shows you that the ofness of the statue, the referential quality of the statue, the aboutness of the statue is not an internal, intrinsic property of the statue. It's extrinsic, as the philosophers say. It's external. It's not local to the statue. And likewise, the ofness or aboutness of thoughts, the meaning of a thought, could not factor at all into explaining why the thought occurred. Because again, the same neurons could fire even if your grandmother, that particular grandmother, or Darwin, or whatever you're thinking of, never existed. Okay? So they can't determine why the thing does what it does because they can't enter into any causal transactions. They're external to the thing. They have nothing to do with it. And now maybe, just maybe, if I'm not slaughtering this, you're going to begin to see why we're talking about this within a larger discussion about what I've called in past episodes neuropolitics. Because this is what neuropolitics is. This is what it does and says. It looks at you, the citizen, the voter, and says, yes, yes, yes. We know you think that you have reasons for what you believe, but those reasons aren't really why causal, why you believe or do anything. The real reasons you, the citizen, the voter, the conservative, the real reasons you believe and do what you do is simply because of the brain states in your brain, in your head, in your cranium. So, they say, and they agree with the Marxists on this, and I've talked about this in the past episode of this series, where now the scientism and the Marxism, right, are starting to come together on this point. So they say, we don't need to address your reasons in the same way that the Marxists, the Antifa, the Black Lives Matter, right? In the same way that they cancel you because they don't need to hear what you have to say. The scientists do it too because your reasons don't matter. It's your brain states. You see? They say, we don't need to address the reasons that you have, the meaning of your thoughts. We just need to look at and maybe alter, like you saw in A Clockwork Orange, and maybe alter your brain. See, you can be re-educated. Now, this is what the naturalist believes. For our purposes, naturalist is just another word for materialist or atheist. Okay? They're subtly different, but for our purposes, they're the same. Now, like I said in the intro here, in an episode or two, we're going to look at a clip from a show on MSNBC, and you're going to see how the assumption of materialism or naturalism drives their whole discussion. And you're going to see the host of the show, incidentally, who is a little Marxist beta male himself, he's going to express frustration that he doesn't want to reason with his political opponents anymore because he thinks something more than reasoning, something stronger is needed in order to force them to behave like his ideology requires them to behave. And you're going to see that he has the guests on his panel that he does because they supply him with the philosophy, the theory that makes this, rather than literally evil, because they supply him with the philosophy that makes this a seemingly reasonable, or literally evil, thing to do. They supply him with the neuropolitics theory. That's why he has this guest on the show who wrote this book called The Republican Mind. Okay? Because what they really mean is the Republican brain. And they're going to go on to talk about all these evolutionary reasons that you think what you think. Because of the supposed natural history. See in our picture, Darwin is sitting atop the steps of the Natural History Museum. They're going to talk about the natural history of your brain states and how they give rise to what you think, and thus why what you think is not an actual result of your reasons. Reasons are things that are had from the inside, the subjective, the mental point of view. Reasons are things that depend on the mental, okay? Reasons are things that depend on meaning and reference and ofness and aboutness. You see? Are you beginning to see? Please, God, see. Okay? Essentially, what they're saying to you, the freedom-loving, God-fearing American conservative, they're saying you think what you don't think what you think because of real meaningful reasons. Rather, you think what you think because of the evolutionary history and brain chemistry behind your coming to be what you are. So we don't need to argue with you anymore. We don't need to debate you anymore. We just need to intervene on your brain. And believe me, that last part, believe me, I can show you conferences, academic conferences, where they literally say this in other contexts, where they're like, look, if we really want to get to the bottom of these problems, the problems with social order, the problems with criminality, the problems with polarization in politics, we need to address the brain. This is no joke. Okay? Okay, so that is the statue on the steps, or Charles Darwin falls down the stairs. And what it's meant to show you is that if you suppose that the mind is the brain, then the content of thoughts becomes irrelevant to why one thought happens after another and one thought succeeds another. And the only explanation that could be needed or even possible for why one explanation, or for why one thought succeeds another, or why one action succeeds one sequence of thoughts, could only be in the brain. Okay? But as we saw, brains are like statues. They're just physical objects. What they do is determined by their physical properties, and ofness, aboutness, reference, representation, the things that we think of, the things that make thought what it is. I'm thinking of my grandmother. I'm thinking of Charles Darwin. What thought is like from the inside, according to this theory, has no bearing on what a person, a thinker with a mind, a brain, does. It can't. The statue would fall down the steps exactly the same. That's my alarm going off. Jocko's still not up. The statue would fall down the steps in the exact same way, even if Charles Darwin never existed. And your brain states would succeed one another. This is not them talking. This is me talking, okay? They have not been sufficiently honest with you that if you accept what they're saying about the mind, the brain being the mind and the mind being the brain, that thinking would go to shit. There's no such thing as thinking, because thinking happens in logical sequence. Thinking depends on the meaning of the thoughts, the aboutness of the thoughts. But those things aren't present at the physical level. They're not present at the physical level. Why aren't they present at the physical level? Again, sorry, just to retread here. Because you could have an identical physical object without the concomitant ofness or aboutness, without the content of the thoughts. You could have a statue that looked just like the statue of Darwin, even if Darwin never existed. And you could have a brain where neurons 456 through 787 fired. You could have a brain where those neurons fired, but the thought of your grandmother never, right, doesn't happen because that particular grandmother, or let's just make it about Darwin. You could have a brain where the same neurons fired, but the thought was not there because Darwin never existed in that world. Okay? Now, going back to the larger theme of this show and its several series is there are places in the history of philosophy and the discussion and writing on and about this subject and related subjects where from time to time someone admits too much of the truth. They say the quiet part out loud. Okay? And I've highlighted a few of those for you, and I want to highlight some more here. I'm going to walk through some quotes for you that show people admitting this. Some of them are on the enemy side, and some of them are on the enemy side but not totally on board with the enemy side, and some of them are on the good side. Okay, but more important to me are the naturalists, are the atheists, are the materialists, right? That admit this in their better moments. That show you that the people coming on the evening news or the talk shows, the podcasts, who are like, oh yeah, we've discovered that the mind is the brain. Their own colleagues call them out. Their own colleagues from time to time will shed light on the fact that this is a scam. That this gap is real, and the people who are hiding it from you are false. Okay? This gap between the mind and the brain is real. You know, a little bit ago I mentioned that when I talk about evolution and stuff, I don't concern myself with the fossils and the DNA and things like that. They're very interesting. But one guy who has very much concerned himself with the DNA stuff, and he's very interesting, I think he was on Joe Rogan very recently, Stephen C. Meyer, right? Meyer. of the Discovery Institute. There's another guy that I corresponded with quite a bit in graduate school. This guy's brilliant, man. But he wrote a book several years ago. I think it was called Signature in the Cell. And one of these naturalist philosophers did a review of that book for the New York Times. And after he did that review of the book for the New York Times, he gave it a positive review. And the evolutionists, the naturalists, went crazy and they canceled him. Okay? Because they could not bear someone admitting that there was arguments against them. Now, of course, the book was about DNA and all that, and that's not what I'm about here. But you see the same attempt to hide the gap or one of the gaps from you, and when somebody breaks ranks, they freak out and assassinate them. They character-wise, they assassinate them. So that philosopher who wrote the review, his name was Thomas Nagel. He's an NYU philosopher of mind, philosopher of language, philosopher of science. Just amazing, amazing thinker, okay? And I want to read to you a quote from a book that he wrote called The Last Word, where he really begins to preoccupy himself with this difference between the inner perspective, the subjective perspective, the perspective that you have as the person with a mind thinking of stuff. What's it like to think of stuff, right? The only way we can identify thoughts is by their objects. In other words, the only way we can identify a thought is by its ofness or aboutness. That's the only way to identify a thought. We can't, listen, in other words, we can't put you on an MRI scan and scan your brain while you're thinking of something and know what you're thinking of. You might say, well, yeah, they've done all sorts of experiments. I see these articles regularly about, advancements in mind reading and stuff like that. No. The only way we can know or claim to know what you're thinking is if the thinker himself tells us, right now I'm thinking of an orange. And then we look at the brain and see, neurons 3 through 17 firing, right? And then we say, oh, those neurons 3 through 17 firing, those must be the thought of an orange. Therefore, now we can read Bill's mind because we see those things firing. So he must be having a thought of an orange, right? There's no way just looking at the brain without the person who's thinking, without the subject telling us what he's thinking of, there's no way that we can tell what he's thinking of because neurons and brain activity are nothing like oranges or your grandmother or Charles Darwin, okay? So I want to read this quote to you from Thomas Nagel, from his book, okay? And I think before I do, I actually want to just pull up a diagram so you can very clearly see. I think I did make this diagram. I'm pretty proud of this. I just want this to be really clear to you. Let me just see if I can whip this up real fast. Maybe this one. Yeah. Oh, this looks complicated, doesn't it? Okay. Let's begin with the dotted line in the middle. It's got this warning sign that says, warning, only... obey physics below, okay? So here we have, so this lower level that's denoted by the B's refers to brain activity. See, neurons fire, and the T's are like time, like at second 1, at second 2. See, time is the horizontal axis, okay? Now, this looks really complicated. I know, just bear with me. It's not. It's just, we're just conceiving of brain activity and mental life. See, up here is the cloud. It's thoughts, right? Okay. So here's this thinker. He has this thought. What does his thought say here? The triangle has 3 even sides, right? And then his next thought is, the triangle must have 3 equal angles. Now, if you know geometry, right, you know that this thought succeeds this thought because of what the thought is about, what it means to have 3 even sides and the properties of geometry that follow from that, right? The ofness, the aboutness of the thought that's only known from the inside, it's perceived from the inside, right? The meaning of the thoughts. That's why this thought follows this thought. I hope you can see my mouse right now. But down here we have the brain activity, and that's just vzz, neurons firing, and vzz, neurons firing, right? Now, the whole question here, right? Here's time 1, time 2. At time 1, I maybe should have put a T up here. I should put an M for mental. Here's time down here, T1 and T2. Now look, at some point, my neurons fire, and I have the thought, the triangle has 3 even sides. And at another point, my neurons fire, and I have the thought, the triangle must have 3 equal angles. Okay? Now, the naturalist who says that the mind is the brain believes, or says he believes, that physical, natural causes are the whole explanation for everything. And therefore, I hope you can see my mouse, the reason I have this thought up here, I'm going to do this real slow now, I'm going to get away from this diagram. I promise you there's a payoff here in 10 seconds. The reason I have this thought up here is wholly explained by this event down here. And the reason that I have this thought up here is wholly explained by this this brain event down here. And that means, here's the payoff, that the reason I have this thought here is not due to the content of this thought here. Do you see? Brain activity is just brain activity. Brain activity is just physical events happening on a physical thing due to the physical properties that it has and the laws that govern physical things of that sort. The statue will fall down the steps in exactly the same way whether Charles Darwin, the content of the statue, existed or not. So the thoughts will happen if the mind is the brain. If the mind is the brain, the thoughts will happen as they'll happen because of the physical causes. Has nothing to do with the rational, logical, meaningful, content-based properties of the thing. Has nothing to do with the fact that it's a statue of Charles Darwin. They happen because of the laws of physics. So there's no connection. Right here, there's no connection. This thing, this thought up here, this conclusion about there being 3 equal angles following from the premise about there being 3 equal sides, this does not happen because this happens. Now you think, if you did high school geometry, you sure enough believe that this happened. You had to learn that this means that you can infer this from that. You can infer this from that. But according to the materialist, if we take their theory seriously, this does not happen because of this in your mind. If the mind is the brain, this happens because these neurons fired, and this happens because these neurons fired, and therefore this does not happen because of this. This down here, B1, brain state 1, is sufficient for, nothing else is needed. This is sufficient for this. And at B2, this should say B2, not B1. Man, I really screwed this up. Brain state 2 is sufficient for this thought. This is just another really complicated way of saying that whether Charles Darwin existed or not, the statue would roll down the steps in the exact same way. Whether I had the thought the triangle has 3 even sides plays no causal role in me then thinking the triangle has 3 equal angles. The physical events, the physical properties of the brain explain it. All right? But that's insane when you think about it, because that's like saying the content of your thoughts has no effect on why one thought succeeds one another. Okay? Should I do the other diagram here? No, I'm going to wait. Okay, let's go back. Now listen, here's Thomas Nagel. And he has laid hold of this, and it's no wonder that they're trying to off this guy now. He's laid hold of this. He's figuring it out. Okay? Thomas Nagel says, he's going to use this phrase here in a moment, platonic harmony. Let me just go back here, because there's the realm of the physical, and there's the realm of the idea. Okay? Here's the realm of the physical down here, and everything below this line obeys the laws of physics, right? And here's the realm of the idea up in here, the mental, the ideal world. Okay? What's happening in your mind versus what's happening in your brain. Okay? Plato was very concerned with the relation of the mental to the physical, of the idea to the sense world, the world that can be sensed and touched and tasted and burned, the world that science studies. Okay? So Thomas Nagel in a moment is going to use this phrase, platonic harmony. And he's just talking about the relations of ideas to one another, okay? Which is what we've been talking about, so I don't want you to be thrown off by that. He says, if we can reason, by the way, let me just stop again. What is reasoning? Reasoning is thinking from the content of one thought to the content of another thought. This triangle has 3 even sides too. This triangle has 3 equal angles. And let me just pull up the other diagram too. See, these are thoughts succeeding one another, but thoughts also precede and cause action. Here's thoughts causing an action. Same diagram, a little bit different, leading to human action, okay? Brain state 1. Again, I did B1 here. I should have done B2. Okay, so brain state 1, brain state 2, brain state 3. This should say M up here, not T. M1, M2, M3. So mental, physical. Okay, mind, brain. You see what my mouse is doing here? Brain down here, mind up here. Everything below this line has to obey the laws of physics. Everything above this line, as Thomas Nagel is going to say in a moment, has to obey Platonic harmony. Okay, so here's a thought. My neurons fire at time 1, and I think, I can barely see this, so I zoom it in. I only had 3 beers last night. Okay? At brain state 1. At time 1, some neurons fire and I have the thought, I only had, does that say 3? 5. 5, I think it says 5. The font is so small. I only had 5 beers last night, okay? Then some more neurons fire and I think the thought, I live alone. And then maybe, I guess I could put in some more thoughts here, right? Another thought that says, there's 6 beers in a pack, right? And another thought that says, there's no one else who's been in the house since last night when I was here drinking my beers. And the final thought is, I have 1 more beer. And then that leads me to an action. I run to the fridge to get the last beer, right? I can't read with this. The font's so small, I can't. But you get the idea, right? It's the content of the thoughts that cause them to succeed one another. But again, we saw in the thought experiment that with the statue, the content of the statue, the aboutness of the statue, the ofness of the statue, the referential qualities of the statue have nothing to do with the causal transactions into which the statue enters as it falls. They don't have anything to do with how it falls. So if the mind is the brain, then the content of thoughts has nothing to do, this is why their theory is absurd, has nothing to do with why the thoughts succeed one another. This thought happens because these neurons down here fired and no other reason. There couldn't be another reason. And this thought happens because these neurons down here fired and no other reason. There couldn't be another reason. And I run to the fridge because these neurons fired for no other reason. It couldn't be the content of the thought. It's that content is extrinsic to the brain. And the only reason one brain state succeeds another is because of the physical properties of the brain itself. And physical properties are local and intrinsic, right? The shape of Darwin's nose on the statue can affect why the statue bounces off step 32, the way it bounces off step 32. But even if Darwin didn't exist, even if that content, that referential property of the statue didn't exist, you could have a statue with the same nose, and if all the antecedent conditions were the same, the statue would fall and bounce the same way. So the content, the referential property, the aboutness of the statue has no bearing on how it behaves. Likewise, the content of the thoughts, as long as the brain states are the same, the contents of the thoughts could have no bearing on why one thought succeeds one another, or why one action succeeded a series of thoughts. They're irrelevant. You have to appreciate, and I'm doing my best, Lord help me to explain to you. I know I'm not the best at this, but no one else is talking about this, and I think this is one of the most important things to understand, and they're hiding it from you. This is one of the most important things. Yes, at the bottom of the culture wars, in modern political, social, religious, cultural life, this is the thing. They want you to think you are strictly a material being. But if you believe you're strictly a material being, thought is obliterated. The meaningfulness of thought is obliterated. It's no wonder why the Marxists cancel you. And it's no wonder why the neurophysiologists want to just dissect your brain and explain why you're a conservative. All right. Feel me? All right. Now, here's Thomas Nagel. He's going to say everything I just said in his own inimitable way. Okay? He's not a Christian. He's not a conservative. He's not a theist. He's a naturalist. But listen to him say the quiet part out loud. Listen to him admit his deepest fear. Are you ready? He says, if we can reason, it is because our thoughts can obey the order of the logical relations among propositions. Propositions are like the contents of our thoughts. I only drank 5 beers last night is a proposition. Therefore, there's 1 more beer in the fridge is a proposition. Okay? And logical relations depend on meaning. They depend on aboutness. See how he's talking about what we're talking about here? He says, if we can reason, it's because our thoughts can obey the order of the logical relations among propositions. So here again, we depend on a Platonic harmony. The reason I call this view alarming is that it's hard to know what world picture to associate it with. And it's difficult to avoid the suspicion that the picture will be religious or quasi-religious. He means non-materialist, right? Because if it's materialist, if the world picture we have is materialist, then all thoughts are just brain events, which makes the logical relations, the content relations, the aboutness relations among thoughts irrelevant. So he's saying if we take seriously that thoughts have to succeed one another in virtue of their logical relations, then we can't really be materialists, guys. Pardon me. Trying a little zen here based on Tucker's recommendation. It's all right. Okay. He says, the reason I call this view alarming is that it is hard to know what world picture to associate it with, and it's difficult to avoid the suspicion that the picture will be religious or quasi-religious. Rationalism has always had a more religious flavor than empiricism. Even without God, the idea of a natural sympathy between the deepest truths of nature and the deepest layers of the human mind, which can be exploited to allow gradual development of a truer and truer conception of reality, i.e. science, makes us more at home in the universe than is secularly comfortable. What does he mean by more at home in the universe? Look, if evolution and the materialist world picture, the materialist worldview is true, you're not at home in the universe. There's nothing that ties you intrinsically to the universe around you. Okay, we're going to have more to say about this in future episodes. This gets so deep. It's only on the religious picture that your mind is made for the world and the world is made for your mind. And that's why science is possible, and that's why reasoning is possible, and all these things, right? If on the evolutionary materialist naturalist picture, you're an accident. You're not at home. You're an accident, okay? You might not have been, you might be. There's no intrinsic connection between your mind and the world around you and the world in which you find yourself, okay? It's all accidental. I know there's people who that this is new for are going to be thinking of all sorts of objections as I say these things. This podcast will be 6 hours if I break down every single sentence of this. I'm just going to get through this, okay? I'm going to come back to this again and again, I'm sure. Rationalism and here I go again, right? By rationalism, he just means the view that there are some important things about thinking that depend strictly on the content of thoughts, and rationalism is the view that not everything that is known by sense experience. And of course, if the mind is not the brain, then rationalism would have to be true, because we couldn't know that the mind is not the brain by sense experience per se. It's a sort of, like we just did, it's a sort of conceptual argument that you have to give, sort of thinking about it that allows you to see it. Not, you don't, right? Okay, let me just go on. Rationalism has always had a more religious flavor than empiricism. Even without God, the idea of a natural sympathy between the deepest truths of nature and the deepest layers of the human mind, which can be exploited to allow gradual development of a truer and truer conception of reality, makes us more at home in the universe than is secularly comfortable. The thought that the relation between mind and world is something fundamental, which is what the creation doctrine implies. Creation, Genesis, Bible. The thought that the relation between mind and world is something fundamental makes many people in this day and age nervous. I believe this is one manifestation of a fear of religion which has large and often pernicious consequences for modern intellectual life. You think? He goes on. In other words, it causes them to run headlong into absurdities in the philosophy of mind, in the philosophy of science. It causes them to embrace absurdities like the idea that the mind is the brain, because if you suppose that it's not, you might have to accept that there is a God that created you, right, and your spirit, your mind, to know yourself and the world, and right, you might have to accept a more robust picture of reality. You might need to repent, okay? That's what he's saying. Listen, he goes on, in speaking of the fear of religion, I don't mean to refer to the entirely reasonable hostility towards certain established religions and religious institutions in virtue of their objectionable moral doctrines, social policies, and political influence, nor am I referring to the association of many religious beliefs with superstition and the acceptance of evident empirical falsehoods. I'm talking about something much deeper, namely, the fear of religion itself. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. Here it is, folks. Here's the truth revealing itself, right? Ready? He says, I want atheism to be true. And I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. That's Thomas Nagel. Okay? So let's just review what he said and tie it together with what we've said. There is something about human thinking that, when we think about it, doesn't seem to fit in any way with the naturalist world picture, as Nagel calls it. That is, the naturalist says that the universe is a whole giant system of interconnected cause and effect. Cause and effect which takes place among fundamental physical properties, and that everything else in the universe comes out of these fundamental interactions of cause and effect among physical properties. Remember our diagram here? Physical, down here, brain states, neurons firing. Everything in the mind comes out of these. And therefore, this over here doesn't come out of this. This thought does not happen because of this thought. The content of this thought doesn't happen because of the content of this thought. The content of this thought happens because of these neurons firing. And the content of this thought happens because of these neurons firing. By the way, if you're listening to this on audio, this is pointless. You got to watch it on YouTube or at Rumble. Okay? I got diagrams here, man. I made diagrams for you. All right, let's go back. So everything that happens in the universe, thoughts included, happens because of the causal interconnection of the fundamental particles that everything is made of. That's the naturalist world picture. And so, as a consequence of this, to fully explain something, we have to explain it in terms of particles interacting according to whatever physical laws govern those interactions. But this means that to explain thinking, ready? Let's go back to the diagram here. I'll do the beer one. Here. This means that to explain thinking, we're just drawing out the implications of what we've said and what Nagel has admitted here, okay? This means that to explain thinking, we have not fully explained it until we have explained it in terms of the particles that compose the brain doing whatever they do according to the physical laws that govern them, the laws of physics. That's why nothing that happens up here is a sufficient explanation. This thought, according to the materialist, right? According to the view that Nagel embraces but is having reservations about, the content of this thought does nothing to explain the content of this thought. The content of this thought is explained by this, and the content of this thought is explained by this. There is no causal connection between any of these events. This thought, or this thought, or this thought, this thought, this thought, this thought, this thought, this action. And therefore, thinking is nonsense. You understand? Think everything. You have to see this. Like, your whole mental life is nonsense according to these people. Let's continue to draw out the implications here. But, admits Nagel, that won't work. Because, as he says, if we can think, see, now he's recognizing there's an ifness here, right? He's like, man, this might make all thinking nonsense, right? But that can't be true because I believe in thinking. He says, if we can think, it's because our thoughts can cause one another in virtue of their meaning. And meaning is not a physical property of anything. I'm going to say that again. Meaning, aboutness, ofness, reference, representation is not a physical property of anything. And this is what the thought experiment of Darwin's statue falling down the steps is meant to illustrate. A statue, just like a word or a symbol or a sign or whatever, refers to something outside of itself. That is, it is about something. But what it's about isn't contained in the physical properties of it. What it's about is out there, extrinsic, external, elsewhere. We illustrated this by pointing out that we might imagine the exact same statue existing even if Charles Darwin never existed. And this shows you that the physical properties of a thing, in this case a statue, are not enough to establish what the statue refers to, what it is about. In other words, what it means. Because you could quite obviously, when you think about it, and we did think about it, you could quite obviously have those same physical properties, not physically identical statue, without having the thing that they refer to. Some creative sculptor could well have chiseled a statue just like that, even if Charles Darwin had never existed. And I wish he never had. When you really appreciate this point, it becomes, and that's why I'm belaboring it here, because I'm insufficient to do this for you, but I don't hear anybody else doing this for you, and I want you to see this. It becomes so obvious that you might be tempted to think that no one would overlook it. Like, once you see this point, you're like, well, what's everybody talking about then? This is clear. But it is overlooked entirely. Because overlooking it allows philosophers and scientists of the mind to pretend that the mind could, in fact, be the brain. After all, some occurrence of some arrangement of active neurons in the brain is just like the statue in this respect. Maybe it refers to the thing that it is supposedly the thought of, but there is no reason why those same neurons could not light up even if that thing never existed. So the thing those neurons are supposedly a representation of has nothing intrinsically to do with that arrangement of neurons. The thought has nothing to do intrinsically with the brain state. And thus it has nothing to do with how they behave. They obey the laws of physics, chemistry, electricity, electromagnetism, so on and so forth. They don't care about the idea of Charles Darwin. You see, I'm just extrapolating the connection between what Nagel has said and what we have said here. So Nagel then, amazingly, points out that this is so obvious when you think about it. Listen, this is so incredible, you guys. Listen, this is what he's admitting in this quote. It's so obvious when you think about it that the reason most thinkers refuse to think about it is because, this is his language, not mine, they're scared. He calls it fear. Because they're scared of what it means. What does it mean? Well, if thinking literally can't take place in a naturalistic world, and if we clearly are thinkers, so thinking is taking place, well then the world must not be what the naturalist says it is. It can't merely be a collection of particles doing stuff according to the laws of physics. Why is that scary? Well, it should be obvious by now. In fact, Nagel's made it obvious. Because that means the world could be, are you ready, full of non-physical stuff, non-material stuff. And people who want God to not exist hate thinking about non-physical stuff, like souls and minds and other stuff like moral laws and even numbers. Numbers! I've mentioned this. I will talk about it later. Numbers. In the past 100 years of philosophy that are called the 100-year fail, would you believe that there's a whole contingent, literally half of philosophers who work in this field, deny the existence of numbers? It's true. They do. They deny the existence of numbers. Why? Because, are you seeing this now? Because, let me say it again, if thinking can't take place in a naturalistic world, and if we clearly are thinkers, so thinking is taking place, well then the world must not be what the naturalist says it is. It can't be merely a collection of particles doing stuff according to physical laws. Why is that scary? Because that means that the world could be full of non-physical stuff, and people who want God to not exist, like Nagel, hate thinking about non-physical stuff. Because that shows the gap. Non-physical stuff like souls, minds, moral laws, and even numbers. Or if you listen to this podcast a long time, you remember the intro where that guy says logical laws. You can't touch a logical law. You can't point to it. You can't burn it on a Bunsen burner. You can't examine it physically. You can't hear it. You can't touch it. And yet supposedly logical laws exist, right? Because we think using them, right? If there's no logical laws, then there's no debate. Then what are we all doing when we talk to each other, right? You understand? There's plenty of non-physical stuff. And these guys hate thinking about that because it means that the world actually has non-physical stuff in it. And if the world has non-physical stuff in it, then the world is not just a collection of physical stuff. And if that's true, well, then there might just be something non-physical behind the world. They hate thinking about it because those things remind them of the ultimate non-physical thing. God. And they hate him. All right. So that was Thomas Nagel. Now let me take you back. I said I'm just reading quotes from people who have sort of latched on to what we're drawing out here. There's been hints of this all throughout the past few hundred years of philosophy, and even and the Thomas Nagel was really recent. Obviously, Thomas Nagel's a contemporary philosopher. Let me take you all the way back to Darwin to show you, no pun intended, a species of this same sort of problem that Darwin's kind of feeling his way towards. Darwin was not a sophisticated philosopher. Darwin was not an analytical philosopher. Darwin was not a philosopher of mind. But he had this worry that he expressed in The Origin of Species. And in this worry that he expressed in The Origin of Species, you can see the kernel, the germ of the very same issue that we are circling and circling and circling here. So I've gone from the contemporary all the way back to Darwin. Now we're going to do some more, but I just want to hop back and forth. Here's Darwin. Listen. He says in The Origin of Species, let me take a sip of coffee. Darwin says, just listen to this. You're gonna see the connection between this and what we're talking about, but I'm also going to expound it right afterwards. Darwin says, with me, the horrid doubt. Listen to that word. Horrid doubt. He's scared. You see, Thomas Nagel was scared. It's emotions that are fueling this philosophical position. Do you see? It's emotions. Darwin says, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. In other words, this horrid doubt has arisen in my mind whether the ideas that people have are important at all if people have developed from lower species. Now, all right, here, Darwin's talking in terms of the evolution of the creature, but ultimately his point is the same. I'm going to make this clear in a minute. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or are at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? All right. Darwin's really important point is in the first two sentences. Actually, I think I might have clipped that quote because that was only two sentences. The second is merely rhetorical. And so an opponent who was resisting the general point has all the sorts of rhetorical room to maneuver around it. But the philosophical point, the fatal point, is made in the first sentence. After all, why would the idea that the human mind evolved out of the animal mind strike Darwin himself with horror. He calls it horrid. It strikes him with horror because he realizes, at least faintly, like it's not as sophisticated of a worry as Nagel expresses, but it's there. The kernel's there. Listen, it strikes him with horror because he realizes, at least faintly, that what he is saying about natural selection turns human thinking into something of an absurdity. Why? Because according to Darwin, the reason why any trait or feature in a creature is what it is because it was just selected for by natural selection. Why is that a problem? Listen, the only criteria natural selection cares about is survival. Why is that important? It's important because that means that ultimately the only reason your thinking processes are what they are is because they catered to survival in past ancestral species. Why is that a problem? Because that means that the notion that those thought processes reliably lead a creature to truth, not survival, but truth, is irrelevant from that perspective. It does not matter what the frog thinks the little black thing buzzing around its head is. It doesn't matter what the truth of what he thinks it is doesn't matter. Just so long as his nervous system has adapted in such a way that he whips out his tongue and grabs it when it flies by. That's what matters for survival. Whether he knows the truth about flies or black things buzzing in his field of vision is irrelevant. Only survival is relevant. Survival is sufficient. If the frog does this, it doesn't matter what the contents of his mind are at all. It doesn't matter if he thinks it's a delicious fly, a tiny monster, a figment of his imagination, a grapefruit, a hologram, or nothing at all. His thoughts are irrelevant so long as natural selection has attuned his system to whip that tongue out and grab it when that thing flies by. Do you see? On Darwin's view, truth about the world around us plays no ultimate role in the creation/evolution of our minds. But then, thinks Darwin, worries Darwin, why do we trust our minds at all? Why does Darwin believe the truth of his own thought that evolution is true if the fundamental mechanism of evolution gives him good reason to think the truth of all thoughts is utterly irrelevant to a creature's activity in evolution? You see. Incidentally, let me just try to do this here. I gotta say this now. This same problem makes a startling appearance in the area of moral reasoning and evolution as well. I mean, you can't drive down the street in my city without seeing some dope in a Subaru wearing a mask in the car alone who no doubt believes that the world is one big accidental conglomeration of physical particles all colliding and combining and decombining in various ways, out of which we have evolved and about which we know nothing more at any given time than what physical science tells us, right? That's why science, quote, capital S, though not really science, is a religion for them. Because on their view, it's a glimpse into the ultimate nature of reality, not just one part of reality. See? But what sticker does this dope have plastered on the bumper of his Subaru? Well, he's actually got a ton of them on the bumper of Subaru. But let's just take one. It says, are you ready? It says, and trust me, there's one, I can go outside my door. There's one driving by right now, I guarantee it. Or my next door, listen. What does the sticker say? Be kind. Right next to their bumper sticker about supporting the killing of unborn children. It says, be kind. Now, I have nothing against being kind. Every great once in a while, I even manage to do it. But if we asked this this fellow citizen, why we should be kind, they would not be able to answer the question in any satisfying way without ultimately going in a logical circle. that is, without making some more general appeal to the importance of kindness, even in their explanation of why a person should be kind. They would have to appeal to kindness to justify kindness. Apparently, you might be saying, what does this have to do with what we're talking about? Just listen. Apparently, kindness, and probably other such moral qualities, are intrinsically valuable to this person. And they're right. They are intrinsically valuable. The problem is that on evolution, they're not intrinsically valuable, right? That means, okay, for this person doesn't realize it, but kindness is intrinsically valuable, and they recognize it. But they don't see that what Darwin is saying makes it not intrinsically valuable, because it's not intrinsic to the world. Intrinsic means valuable in and of itself, and not as a means to something else. Why is this a problem when you can join it with evolution? Because taking evolution seriously requires coming to terms with the fact that your moral beliefs, ready? Just like what we said above, in terms of thinking and the fly and the frog. Taking evolution seriously requires coming to terms with the fact that your moral beliefs are what they are only because natural selection found them useful for survival. In other words, they are not intrinsically valuable, that is, valuable in and of themselves. Rather, they only proved valuable in facilitating survival in the particular circumstances and the environment that the species found itself in when they appeared. And, here's the upshot, any number of other beliefs might just as well have done the trick. So kindness is just a one among many possibilities. Just like the frog can believe the fly is anything at all, just so long as he reliably captures it with his tongue when it flies by. So, on this view, morality is not a thing that is valuable in its own right. It's just a useful tool natural selection made use of. Any number of other tools, maybe even morality's opposite, might have done the trick in different circumstances. So the person with a Darwin sticker on one side of their bumper and a Be Kind sticker on the other side is, to put it kindly, a fool, an idiot. But I'm going off on a little tangent about the relation of all this stuff to morality. I want to get back to the mind here. So, as stated, Darwin's fear was very generally stated by him, and it took a while for thinkers, the honest ones, to work out the problematic implications, the horrid doubts that Darwin found himself admitting of. But one such thinker, J.B.S. Haldane, one of the founders of the modern genetic theory and its synthesis with Darwin's evolutionary theory, did just that. Haldane comes right after Darwin, or a little while after Darwin, much more proximate to Darwin than Nagel, who we started with. Haldane is one of the heroes of evolution. He combined the discovery of genetics with Darwin's theory. But Haldane, too, then was like, hold on a second. What did my daughters say? Hold on a second. Okay, sorry. You know the meme. Hold on a moment. It's 5 a.m. This is Haldane. Listen to this. And now, let me actually, when I say this, let me bring up the diagram again. The flawed, albeit meritorious diagram. I worked hard on this, man, but I still screwed it up. So I'm going to just leave this diagram up here while I read Haldane's quote, and then, just like we have with the past two quotes, we're going to expound on what the quote means in terms of what we've been saying here. Haldane says, "It seems to me immensely unlikely that mind is a mere byproduct of matter." Let me jump over here. Look in the diagram. Mind is a product. It's caused by the mental event is caused by the material event. The mental event is not caused by another mental event. Each mental event is a byproduct of the material event. Mind is caused by matter. Okay? Seems to me immensely unlikely, says Haldane, that mind is a mere byproduct of matter. For if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. Sorry, I get a little excited. He says, they might be sound chemically, but that does not make them sound logically. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. See, Haldane has gone a little bit further than Darwin here. Haldane has realized that this whole snake eats itself. The snake eats its tail. The whole thing devours itself. If I really suppose that the mind is the brain, then all my mental events are simply because of physical events. But physical events, or chemical events, or electromagnetic events, whatever you want to call them, just obey the laws of that thing. But if they just obey the laws of that thing, of that field, of that material, right, and what governs those things, then they don't obey the logical laws between the content of the thoughts. If they don't obey the logical laws of the content between the thoughts, then all my thoughts are irrelevant, including my thought that naturalism is true. Do you see? My whole theory falls on itself. It collapses from underneath because my theory was based on me supposing that my thoughts cause one another because of their logical contents. In other words, thinking is a thing. Haldane is here recognizing an absurdity that is lurking just behind the idea that the whole of reality is made of nothing more than tiny particles, all of one kind at very bottom, combining and decombining, causing and affecting one another in various ways as determined by whatever physical laws are operant on them and govern them. In other words, he's recognizing the fatal absurdity of naturalism. What is that absurdity? Look at the phrase he uses. The phrase is wholly governed. If my thoughts are determined wholly by the behavior of those particles, then I have no reason to trust my thoughts. Why? Because that means that my thoughts are not determined by anything outside of my head, namely the things in the world that those thoughts seem to be about. Remember the statue? Remember? You see it now? We're like an hour and a half in. Do you see it now? That means that I have no reason to trust my thoughts about what the whole world is either, because the whole world is outside of my head too. And therefore, I have no reason to believe that naturalism is true, because naturalism is a belief about what the whole world, the whole reality, is made of. And I supposedly reached naturalism by reasoning. But if naturalism is true, reasoning is impossible because thoughts are not determined and they do not succeed one another in thought because of their content, because of their meaning. Reasoning depends on meaning. Meaning depends on content. Content is outside the brain. Do you see? We could have an identical statue physically. And if all the conditions were the same, it would fall down the stairs the exact same way, even if Darwin, the content of the statue, the reference of the statue, the meaning of the statue, the thing that the statue is about or of, even if he never existed. His existence, the thing outside there in the world, what the statue's of, is irrelevant to how the statue behaves. If the mind is the brain, what thoughts are of, what they are about, is irrelevant to how they behave. In other words, to how they occur in your head. If the content of thoughts is irrelevant to how thoughts occur in your head, then the thought, naturalism or evolution must be true, is also nonsense. Because you supposedly reached it by reasoning, which you've just proved is impossible. So, we've seen Nagel, we've seen Darwin, we've seen Haldane. From Darwin to Haldane, we've increased the complexity of the point a little bit here. Okay, let's look. Oh, we did the diagram. Let's not do that yet, or let's not do that again. I've been back and forth between the diagram here enough. Let's do this. Let's do this. Oh man, we're doing it. We're getting through this. Listen, it's gonna get. We're doing it. This is long form. This is the thing to do these days. This is long form. I told you it's a deep dive. I told you this is a deep dive. Okay, so maybe pause it. Come back after your workout. Come back after the work. Whatever you got to do. It's gonna get shit gets deeper. Okay, here is before Darwin. Let's go back before Darwin. John Locke. All right, John Locke, in many ways a founder of our country. And people always talk about Locke's ethical theory and his doctrine of natural rights and tolerance and things like that, and how important those are to the American idea. What is neglected is how closely Locke's thought tracked and agreed with Descartes about the mind, because Locke doesn't really talk about the human mind per se, but he talks about the idea of a mind. He's talking about God in this quote, but he's talking about the idea of a mind being made of material and how absurd that is. This is from his essay concerning human understanding, and this is it, man. This is everything I've been trying to say to you here is in Locke's quote, but it's in that, Locke's a precise philosopher, and this is that, you're gonna have to work through this. It's one paragraph, but this is bonkers. Okay, everything I'm trying to communicate to you in these dumb little diagrams I keep throwing up. Okay, where are they? This one. Okay, it's all here. Okay, Locke asked the question in his famous epistemological treatise, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, where he's trying to get to the bottom of what knowledge is and what its limits are and what it even is. What even is that, right? And how it's to be had, how we can, he's trying, in a discussion of knowledge, he comes to the question of what the mind itself could be, but he's asking this question about God. I mean, because God is presumably more like something of a mind than a baseball. Okay, God's a person. God has personality. Persons have mind. That's the theory of this whole. That's the theme of this whole series, right? That's the distinguishing characteristic of a person is mental life. Okay. So Locke says, could God be a material being? I'm going to leave God out of it. There's enough in Locke. There's enough in Locke to just make this purely about the mind. He is talking about the mind, but he has this discussion in the course of a discussion about God. So let me just leave the God part out of it. It's clear what Locke means in this passage. I'm just gonna talk about in that frame. Okay, listen. As I talk, maybe look at this diagram, maybe don't. I don't know if that helps, but I'm just going to read you this quote from Locke, and Locke is going to give you the exact precise reason that the very thing I'm trying to communicate in this diagram and that the statue on the steps is meant to illustrate. Locke sees it, and you will see it too. There's some philosophical language in here, but I hope at this point you'll see it. Look, I'm sorry. This is so important. It's so hard to know how many 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back to go with this, because it's just so profound. Locke is asking here. Okay, look. Locke is asking the question: could the mind be a physical thing? And he says no. And here's why. He says, if it be the motion of its parts, he says, suppose it's a physical thing. If it be the motion of its parts on which its thinking depends, all the thoughts must there be unavoidably accidental and limited, since all the particles that, by motion, cause thought, being each of them in itself without any thought, cannot regulate its own motions, much less be regulated by the thought of the whole, since that thought is not the cause of the motion, for then it must be antecedent to it, and so outside of it, but the consequence of it, whereby freedom, power, choice, and all rational and wise thinking or acting will be quite taken away. Incidentally, what do the leftists want to take away from you these days? Freedom, power, choice, and all rational and wise thinking. Isn't that remarkable? Listen, I'm so tempted in this quote. I just read like 3 sentences. I'm so tempted to stop at the end of each one of these sentences and do a little discussion to make clear what he's saying. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to read the quote and then I'm going to expound it. Trust me. Where was I? Okay. Let me back up 1 sentence. No, let's just start from the beginning. Ready? Hear it again for the first time. Let's suppose that the mind is the brain. If it be by the motion of its parts on which its thinking depends, then all the thoughts there must be unavoidably accidental and limited, since all the particles that by motion cause thought, being each of them in itself without any thought, cannot regulate its own motions, much less be regulated by the thought of the whole. since that thought is not the cause of the motion, for then it must be antecedent to it, and so outside of it, but rather the consequence of it, whereby freedom, power, choice, and all rational and wise thinking or acting will be quite taken away. So that such a thinking being will be no better and no wiser than pure blind matter. Since to resolve all into the accidental unguided motions of blind matter, or into thought depending on unguided motions of blind matter, is the same thing. Not to mention the narrowness of such thoughts and knowledge that must depend on the motion of such parts. Believe me, this is it. Let me see if I can expound this a little bit. If we're going to say, remember a couple episodes ago when I showed this diagram, I think? And I was talking about Democritus, the pre-Socratic philosophers, and that there was a little bit of a worry back there with those guys, or there should have been, that if they were trying to answer the question, look, how can perception happen? I know this is a little bit different discussion, but you'll see the resemblance. You'll see the family resemblance here. Democritus, they're trying to be like, well, how is it that I can see a tree? Right? This is pre-Socratics. This is ancient philosophy, right? They're like, how is it that the tree can be over there and I can see it even though I'm over here? How does perception work? And they're like, oh, the tree must give off little images of itself that float from the tree and then impress themselves on your retina and your optic nerve and eventually your brain, and then results in the image of a tree in the brain, right? In the mind, whatever, right? And it sounds ridiculous, but at the same time, it's like, okay, but if that sounds ridiculous, how does it work? I mean, it's a good question. How does it work? You don't know how it works, bro. You know how it works. But if you think about it, the problem with that is, okay, you have the idea of a tree in your mind, and here's the tree over here, but those particles, or whatever that image thing is made of, those don't know anything about a tree, right? The idea in your mind is a result of those particles, or whatever that image is made of. Particles, I don't know. You see, they don't know that the tree is the concept that they themselves are the parts of. So if you have this concept of a tree in your mind based on your perception of the tree over here, then how do those particles go, or that image knowing from here to here, know that they're a tree? How do they not get screwed up or mistranslated in this trip from here to, like, okay, forget it. Let me just go back to Locke. I'm sorry. There's a connection here, but let me just go back to Locke. If we're going to say that the mind is just the brain, this is Locke expounded now. This is so profound. If we're going to say that the mind is just the brain, then everything found in the mind must be a result of what is found in the brain, and what is found and what's found there is doing. Okay, then. Suppose I have in my mind an idea of, let's go back to our diagram here, an idea of an isosceles triangle. After just finishing some assigned reading in my geometry textbook, I think about what I've been told about the equal angles of this triangle, and I realize through a series of connected thoughts that the triangle must have equal sides as well. Locke is saying that whatever thought I arrive at, like the true one about the equal angularity or the equal sides, equilaterality, I can't say it, right? It's not even a word, it's okay. Okay. Oh, here, equilaterality, it's not a word. Whatever thought I'm having about the equal angles resulting in the equal sides could not have anything to do with triangles. What? Why? How? Look, says Locke. We're saying that the mind is supposedly just the brain. So whatever thoughts I'm having, like the thoughts of equal angularity, it's hard to say, comes about solely as a result of brain activity. And brain activity is just the sum total of the activity of the little parts. Now, continues Locke, none of those little parts know about or care about or have anything whatsoever to do with triangularity or anything of the sort. They're just little parts, little cells or neurons or electrons or corpuscles, as they called them in Locke's day, or whatever, however deep down you go. About any one of them, we can ask, why is it doing what it's doing? And the question will be exhaustively answered by reference to other prior particle behavior, none of which has anything to do with triangles. Neurons have nothing to do with triangles, nor any geometric properties of triangles, okay? They are, as Locke says, here's the word he uses, blind to those things. So if each individual neuron does what it does for a reason that is fully explainable, remember Haldane's phrase? He said wholly determined, right? If each one does what it does for reasons that is fully explainable, if each individual neuron does what it does for a reason that is wholly explained by biological and deeper down chemical and deeper down physical laws, then what does that mean? That means they're not doing what they're doing because of anything about the idea of triangularity itself. The Platonic harmony that Nagel talked about is impossible. In fact, Nagel, remember the opening of Nagel's quote? If we can think it's because our thoughts can obey, what did he say? The Platonic harmony, right? But if none of the individual particles does what it does because of anything that is true about triangularity, and if, as we're supposing, the whole thought is nothing more than those physical particles, then also the whole thought cannot do anything to itself or other thoughts, like cause them or be an effect of them, because of what is true about triangularity. Triangularity never enters into the picture of why the thought is doing what it's doing or why any other thought is doing what it's doing to it. Triangularity is irrelevant. But if the idea of triangularity, for example, plays no role in the cause and effect of my thoughts about triangles, then why do I believe or trust my thoughts about triangles? It's nonsense. Triangularity never enters the picture because the naturalist restricts his picture, remember that phrase, world picture from Nagel, restricts his picture of reality so tightly that he only allows little physical particles doing stuff into that picture. And as Locke points out, if that's true, those little physical particles cause the contents of my thoughts. But that means that they cannot be caused by the contents of my thoughts. You see? The idea of a triangle or anything about the idea of a triangle cannot govern what my thought of a triangle does, because that thought is, on this hypothesis, the result of all those little particles. You can't have the causation going both ways, right? It's the result of all those little particles. So about any one of those particles, we can ask, why is it doing what it's doing? The answer can't have anything to do with triangularity. Do you see? Do you see? If it's true, this is what Locke points out. If those little particles cause the contents of my thought, let me back up. Triangularity never enters the picture because the naturalist restricts his picture of reality so tightly that he only allows little physical particles doing stuff to enter into that picture. And as Locke points out, if that's true, that those little particles cause the contents of my thoughts, that means that they cannot be caused by the contents of my thoughts, which means that my thought about triangularity, which is supposedly the sum total of all the particles in my brain doing something at some particular time, that thought cannot govern or determine the behavior of those particles, since it's the result of them. See? Either they cause the content of my thought, or the content of my thought causes them to do what they do. But you can't have it both ways. See? But then that means that the concept of triangularity on this hypothesis can't play any role in my thinking about triangularity, which is fucking absurd! So Locke points out, but in slightly gentler language. All right? Now, I realize this is probably your first time hearing all this, and there's no way to get it all the first time. At a very minimum, from my emphaticness, you might be realizing that there's something here to be thought about. Keep at it, okay? What's interesting is that it's not new. Locke was onto this back in the 1700s, right? Locke was onto this. When did Locke write? Late 1600s? Yeah, early 1700s, late 1600s. Locke was onto this, okay? And still, in our day, the professors that are making $200,000-$300,000 a year lying to your kids, okay, are hiding it from you because they don't want it to be true. They fear it, like Nagel said. And yet, the best and brightest among them have these little moments of honesty. They have these little moments where they're like, wait. Here's another one from Brown University, one of the most highly regarded, and I already quoted multiple times in this series and from the first series from Darwin to Donald Trump. I already quoted William Lycan. I'm not going to run through that quote again, but if you remember that quote, it's like the same flavor as all these, right? He's like, look, I'm an atheist, I'm a naturalist, I'm a materialist, but let's be honest, the shit doesn't work, okay? That's what he says, okay? Now here's another philosopher, one of the most famous philosophers of mind. I got to get started on my day here soon. It's 6 a.m. One of the most famous philosophers of mind in recent times from Brown University. He's a naturalist. He's one of these guys too. He's on the team, but he's breaking ranks a little bit, admitting there's a problem here. I'm not going to do as much exposition on his quote. We're at 2 hours here, so I'm going to read this quote. Then I'm going to read another one, and you're going to get maybe one or two more. Look, I hope you see this. Listen to Jaegwon Kim, this Korean guy from Brown University, highlighting the same problem. This is going to be in super philosophical language, but given all that we've said so far, you might see that he's talking about the same issue. He's talking about mental causation, not brain causation, mental causation. How can the content of one of my thoughts either cause or be caused by the content of another one of my thoughts? If the brain activity underneath the thought, if the physical underneath the mental is enough to explain the occurrence of the mental, then the mental doesn't play any role with explaining the occurrence of the other mentals, right? The arrows in the diagram go up. These ones going across are irrelevant because this one is fully explained by this, and this one is fully explained by this. This thought is fully explained by this physical event in the brain, and this thought is fully explained by this physical event in the brain. And so this thought does not need this thought as a cause. It's irrelevant. This thought is irrelevant to the occurrence of this thought. But if that's true, there's no such thing as logical thinking. See? Trust me, I've sat in philosophy of mind seminar after philosophy of mind seminar. They try so desperately. I call this the deep dive. This is a high level 30,000 foot thing we're doing here. Okay. They try so hard to get around this. I watched a professor of mine that I worked with they try so hard to get around. There's no way around it. There's no way around it. And they know it, but they exist doing this little dance of sophisticated philosophy, pretending like there's some way around it. And because it's so sophisticated, it's virtually impenetrable. You can't see through it. So they just go on and go on and go on with little diagrams and bullshit like this. It's impossible to get around. Their own theory has destroyed their own theory. Here's Jaegwon Kim. The possibility of human knowledge, he says, presupposes the reality of mental causation. See what he's saying? If we can have knowledge, then the contents of one thought must be able to cause the contents of another thought. In other words, the fact that the statue is of Darwin needs to play a role in why the statue falls down the steps that it does. But we saw that it doesn't, if materialism is true, right? He's saying it does need to play a role, but we can't figure out how it could. Listen. The possibility of human knowledge presupposes the reality of mental causation. Perception, our sole window on the world, requires the causation of perceptual experiences and beliefs by physical objects and events around us. Reasoning, by which we acquire new knowledge and belief from the existing fund of what we already know or believe, involves the causation of new belief by old belief. More generally, causation arguably is essential to the transmission of evidential groundedness. I'm not justified in believing that I can go to the fridge and find a beer unless I'm justified in believing the content of my other thoughts about how many beers I had last night, how many were in the pack, nobody else has been in the house, so on and so forth. Right? Like the content of those thoughts play a logical role among one another. But if each one of those thoughts, let me go back to that diagram. Actually, I can't. Oh, there. But if each one of those thoughts is fully explained by the brain state below it, is fully caused by the brain state below it, then there's no causation happening from one thought to the next. It's all at the level of the brain. Darwin, the statue would roll down the steps even if Darwin never existed. Jaegwon Kim is saying we need the existence of Darwin to be relevant, to be causally relevant to how the statue rolls down the steps. He goes on. To appreciate, let me just flip this back now. What's happening here? All right, there's Darwin. All right, he goes on. To appreciate the exclusion problem. No, sorry, he calls this the exclusion problem. It's called the exclusion problem because we have this problem whereby content is excluded from the causal story. Reference is excluded from the causal story. Darwin, the existence of that guy, is excluded from the causal story about why the statue rolls down the steps the way it does. You see, he says, to appreciate the exclusion problem, we do not require much heavy-duty metaphysics or overarching doctrines about mental anomalism, strict laws and causal relations, a physical-mechanical conception of causality, token physicalism, and the rest. Rather, it arises from... I know there's a lot of words there. Just bear with me. We're at 2 hours here. He says, it arises from the very notion of causal explanation, and what strikes me as a perfectly intuitive and ordinary understanding of the causal relation. Do you know what he just said to you? He just said to you, hey, philosophy student, you know this stupid little thought experiment that Nick's giving you about a statue rolling down the steps? That's all you need to see this. That's what he's saying. Do I need to go on to finish this quote? This gets deep in the weeds here. No. Okay. So he's saying it's very basic. It doesn't require any of the sophisticated stuff to see why this is a huge problem. It's very basic. Okay. Now let's get even more basic. Okay. Another famous philosopher of mind, secular, materialist, atheist philosopher of mind in our day, Jerry Fodor, I believe has passed away. Irrelevant. Oh, not relevant. Not irrelevant, but irrelevant. Okay. Jerry Fodor is famous for his theory of the language of thought. He was a philosopher who was trying to explain, if the mind is the brain, what could, the contents, how could brain states be thoughts? And he gave this idea of this theory called the language of thought, and that the thoughts occur in sort of like symbols in the same way that language occurs in symbols. It's all bullshit. It all doesn't work, but that's what Jerry Fodor is famous for. And Jerry Fodor is also famous for saying, this is called a table pounder. I'm going to pound the table when I say it, because he's pointing out the obviousness of this, just like Jaegwon Kim just did, where he's like, look, you don't need to be sophisticated to see this. Nick's stupid little thought experiment about the statue of Darwin rolling down the steps is sufficient. Jerry Fodor pounds the table and says, if it isn't literally true that my wanting is causally responsible for my reaching, and my itching is causally responsible for my scratching, and my believing is causally responsible for my saying, if none of that is literally true, then practically everything I believe about anything is false, and it's the end of the world. And you know what? I'm going to leave it there. Because it feels, depending on your eschatology, it does feel like we're getting damn close to the end of the world. I don't know how that all plays out, but I do know that if you want to understand the game that is being run on you by the materialists, and how the scientific materialists and how that's all coalescing with the materialist Marxists and all this nonsense we see in our culture these days and the culture wars, you have to understand this gap. And that is what this series is about. And I hope that you have enjoyed part B, part 2 of the deep dive. And I hope that you now can in some sense see how it is absolutely impossible, if thinking is a real thing, how it is absolutely impossible that the mind could be the brain. You are, as a creature of God, mind and body, spirit and flesh, material and immaterial. Okay? I'll see you in part 7 of this series. The series is Mind the Gap. We'll see what happens in part 7. Thank you for listening for almost exactly 2 hours. Good Lord. All right. See you next time.